Hello, welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 52, Attributes. In this session, we'll understand the purpose of attributes, using an attribute in an example, and customizing attributes using parameters. Now let's understand what an attribute is and what is the purpose of attributes in life. Basically, attributes allow us to add declarative information to our programs, and this information can then be retrieved at runtime using reflection. Let's look at an example which will make this clear to us. Now let's say I have a very simple calculator class, so public class calculator. And all this class does is it has got an add method which can basically add two numbers. So first number and a second number. So what this method does, it adds those two numbers and return their sum. So return the sum of first and second numbers. Okay, now if people want to use this method, all they do is, since this is a static method, they can invoke it on the name of the class. So calculator class dot add, and then maybe I want to add 10 and 20. Okay, so here if I want to add two numbers, then this method is useful. Let's say for example there are users who want to add three numbers. So is this function useful? No. So what we have to do is probably add another overloaded version of add that can add three numbers. So if I just make a copy of this, so maybe I will have something like this, maybe another third number and third number, and then what we will do, we will return the sum of that as well. Okay, all right, so if somebody wants to add three numbers, they can do that now. They can also pass in maybe another third number. Okay, fine, but let's say there is another user who wants to add five numbers. Now if you look at this, we might add another method which takes in 5 parameters. But what if there is a user who wants to add 20 parameters? Do you create a method with 20 parameters? No. So basically the way we have thought about this, initially when we are developing the calculator class, we didn't think about the requirements of the future, and we just provided an add method which can add two numbers. But the requirements over the period of time have changed, and users want to add more number of numbers. And to allow users to do that, okay, we are adding an enhancement to our class. And probably what you can do is, I am adding maybe a list of integers. And by the way, list is a generic collection which is present in system.collections.generics. So import that namespace, and then what I want to basically do is list of int, and then we can pass in numbers. So now if you look at this method, whoever wants to add like 3 or 4 or 5 or even 2, they can just pass in those two numbers as a list of integers, and your method will be capable of doing that. So let's quickly implement this. So for each int number in numbers, so what we want to do, we want to add those numbers, and let's create a simple sum variable to hold the sum. So int sum is equal to 0, and what we can do, sum is equal to sum plus number, and basically this is the implementation of this method. And finally we want to return the sum. Okay, now if you look at this method is pretty useful. Now this method can basically add two numbers, three numbers, five numbers, depends on the user how many numbers he wants to add, because it is taking in a list of numbers. And why did we introduce this method? Because of the limitations of this method. Okay, it can only add two numbers, this method, but whereas this method can add any number of numbers. Okay, so as we go forward, this calculator class, if you look at this method is an outdated method, but whereas this is a new method. So anybody who is using your calculator, you want the users to use the new method that you have introduced here instead of the old add method. Okay, so how do you tell the users to do that? Now you might be thinking, okay, instead of doing that, what if I am to remove this method? Okay, if you remove this method, there might be users who were using your add method before and they will break. Okay, that's why you have to leave that old method there for backward compatibility. People who are already using your add method shouldn't break, and they should continue to work the way they are. But new people, whoever are going to use your calculator, you want to tell them to use the new method. How do you do that? An example would be to use an attribute. Okay, so within the .NET framework, there's an attribute called obsolete attribute, which we can use. Now, using that attribute, I can add declarative information to this method. For example, the absolute attribute, the way we add it is. Now look at this. This user is using this add method and we don't get any compilation error. I mean error or a warning message. Look at this. When I try to build the solution and if I go into the output window, it says, okay, we don't have errors or warnings. So let's say rebuild the solution. And if you now go to the window, so 1 succeeded, 0 failed, 0 skipped. There are no errors or there are no warnings. Okay. Now what I want to basically do is if somebody uses this method add, which takes in two numbers instead of the list one, I want to show a warning message in the compiler window. Is that possible? Absolutely, that's possible using attributes, and we can make use of obsolete attribute. And you look at the name obsolete, the name itself says something is obsolete, outdated. This method is outdated, and this is the one which people should be using. So now what I can do is I can use the obsolete attribute. So just decorate your method with obsolete, and look at this. The moment we have done that, you see a green squiggly line there indicating that calculator.add, which takes in two integer parameters, is obsolete. Look at that window. Okay, so this, I'm using this attribute to add some declarative information to this method. Okay, so if you look at the definition, so what's an attribute? An attributes allow you to add declarative information to your program. This information can then be queried at runtime using so using reflection. What this Visual Studio is doing is, okay, this add method has got obsolete. Okay, so it's checking that when I am using that add method, it's actually checking, okay, there is an obsolete attribute, and the purpose of this one is to generate compiler warnings and errors, and it displays that information to us. And how is that possible? Because of this attribute. So attributes basically allow you to add information to your methods or types or even at the assembly level. Apply attributes to properties, methods, classes, etc. And the way you apply them is you apply, let's say for example, I want to add an attribute to this method. I just specify it just before that, using square brackets. Now let us say how to customize this attribute. Now if you look at this attribute, okay, if I build my solution, okay, build succeeded on the status bar, if I go to the output window, you should see that there is 0 errors and 1 warning. And if you look at that warning, it clearly says, okay, calculator.add int comma int, fine, it's obsolete. Okay, if I'm not supposed to use this add method, then which method am I supposed to use? The way you're using the obsolete attribute here is not that useful to the developer who is using your class, because you're telling him this add method is obsolete, but you're not providing him with an alternative. And to do that, you can actually customize this. Okay, so what I basically can do, look at this. To this attribute, I can pass in, look at this, there are 3 overloaded obsolete attribute constructors. Okay, so one of 3, one version which does not take any parameter. If you look at the other one, it takes a string message, and if you look at another one, it takes a boolean error. Okay, so which means using this overloaded version of this attribute, and look at this, when I right click on this obsolete attribute and say go to definition, what's an attribute? An attribute is nothing but a class. If you look at this, the name of this class is obsolete attribute, and this is inheriting from the base system.attribute class. So keep that in mind. All attributes directly or indirectly inherit from system.attribute class. And what are attributes? They are nothing but they are also classes. And if you look at this class, it has got three constructors. And when you are using that attribute, you're actually creating an instance of that attribute class, and you're using one of the overloaded constructors and passing in parameters to customize the message that you want to have displayed. Okay, in this case, let's say I want to tell the user to use this method instead of add int. So how do I do that? There is one of the overloaded constructor of this obsolete attribute class which takes in a string message, so I can pass my string message here. So what I'm saying is use add of list, which takes a list of integers. Okay, so what we are doing now is basically we are passing in this message into this attribute. Now if I hover my mouse over here, okay, let's build this. And now if you look at this, look at that. It says calculator.add that takes in two integer parameters is obsolete, but whereas add list of int, it says use add list of int numbers method. Okay, so this method is obsolete. Use add of list, add method that takes in a list of parameters. So now if I just say instead of this one, okay, let's pass in a list of integers. So list of integers, and let's say I want to pass in 10, 20 and 40, and let's see what happens. Now if we build the solution, I have the compiler warning now? I don't. So obviously this has served my purpose. Now I want to tell to my users of this calculator class, this method is obsolete. They shouldn't be using that. How am I doing that? Using the obsolete attribute. We have also seen how to customize the message that is shown to the user using parameters. And we also understood that an attribute is nothing but a class that inherits from system.attribute class. And another thing, if you look at this, if I right click on that and say go to definition, the name of the class is actually obsolete attribute. But if you look at the way we are using it, we are saying obsolete. So how is that possible? Actually, you can also use attribute here. So this attribute part of the attribute is optional. Okay, now the behavior is exactly the same except that this is optional. You can either use it or not. Okay, so let's get back to the slides. So we have seen how to use attributes, customize the message they display to the user. And within .NET Framework, actually there are two types of attributes. One is the predefined attributes which are actually provided by .NET Framework, like obsolete attributes. We have seen an example of how to use that. And there is a web method attribute. For example, if you're an ASP.NET programmer and if you're developing web services, and as part of that web services you want to expose a method as a web service method, then you have to decorate that with web method attribute. Probably when we talk about ASP.NET, that's when we will see how to use this web method attribute. And similarly, for example, if you're working across application domains, for example, if you're developing a remote application or a WCF application where the objects will be crossing application domain boundaries, then those object needs to be serialized. And one of the simple ways of serializing a class is to make use of serializable attribute. Okay, so there are several attributes like this, and it is also possible to create our own custom attributes. Okay, but creating custom attributes, we'll talk about that in a later session. But just understand that there are lots and lots of predefined .NET attributes that we can make use of for a variety of purposes. Okay, and we have also understood an attribute is a class that inherits from system.attribute base class. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET and C# interview questions. And by the way, I just forgot to tell you one more thing. This attribute class, you can customize it to the next level as well. If you look at this obsolete attribute, it has got another constructor which takes in another parameter, boolean, true or false, and it says error. Okay, now by default that's false, meaning look at this, I can pass in the second parameter into this method, And what does it say? The Boolean value that indicates whether the obsolete element usage is considered an error. Now, if you want the users to prevent using this method completely, then you can say, to this parameter, you can pass in true. So now when you pass in true to this parameter, you're basically telling, okay, this method is obsolete. If anybody tries to use this method, just raise an error. That's what this parameter does. So if I go ahead and use the older version, some 10, 50, and look at this, the moment I do that, the moment I flip to using this method, I already have a red squiggly there indicating, calculator.add is obsolete, and it's a red squiggly meaning an error. If I try to go to the output window, you should see, error list, you should already see that. Okay, calculator.add int comma int is obsolete. Use this method instead. Okay, so it's able to raise error message. So it's completely attributes using parameters. You can completely customize them and then use it to your need. All right, so on this, find resources for ASP.NET C# interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Good day.